Welcome to Back from the Abyss. I'm Dr. Craig Heacock. I wanted to start with a thank you to the listeners who have decided to help pay for the out-of-pocket costs for the podcast. I've been reaching out to the supporters, and it's been really wonderful to hear how the podcast has affected each of them. So if you too would like to help support the show, click on the Support the Show link in the show notes. I would love to reach out to you and hear what you have to say. In Season 3, we did a 2-episode series on adoption, where we featured 2 adoptees sharing their complex legacy of the adoptions. I learned so much from their wisdom, and I came to realize how completely naive I was prior to that about the profound psychological and psychospiritual consequences of adoption, even when the adoption, quote-unquote, goes well. I've been looking for a story about adoption from the adoptive parent's perspective, and here it finally is. Today, our storyteller, Frank, he shares the joy, confusion, chaos, utter fear, and deepest gratitude when he and his partner, Brad, adopted 2 boys, ages 4 and 2, from the foster care system. 20 years ago, when Frank adopted the boys, trauma was not in the public awareness as it is today. And he was told that these little boys who'd spent some time in a meth house might well have some challenges, but he never could have expected what awaited. Can love overcome trauma? Can stability and structure and patience and compassion adequately compensate for profound early childhood neglect and abuse? Frank's story is just one example, but it's a beautiful one. These 2 dads trying to find a way to heal deep attachment wounds without a roadmap.
Brad and I met like you're supposed to. We met in a bar. And he was surrounded by hairdressers. I'm also the stylist, so it was really easy to talk, amongst this group of people. But in talking to Brad, we quickly learned that we had this whole community in common, yet we had never met. So we proceeded to chat that evening. He gave me his phone number. I thought he's never going to call. He was supposed to call 3 days later. He called 2 days later. I screened. Then I called him back, and we arranged to have dinner the next night. So 3 days after meeting, we had our first dinner. We had dinner again the next night, again the next night. And then that following morning, we went for a walk and just sort of laid all the cards on the table. What our debts were, what our health was, just all of those things. We just like, let's either scare this person away or let's just get everything out of the way that we're fearful of. After we sort of, aired our dirty laundry to each other, Brad said, I really want to be a dad. And that just really struck me. I had never really thought about it. Growing up, as a gay man, it just didn't even cross my mind. Didn't seem like it was a possibility. Growing up gay at the time that I did, there weren't any role models. There was certainly caricatures on television, but that was really it. And of course, none of them had children. So I come from a very large family. My mom had 12 brothers and sisters. So I'm used to lots of people around. So the moment I heard that idea, I thought, yeah, why not? And, at the time, I was really grieving my little brother who had committed suicide. He was addicted to drugs, and he had 2 young boys. My parents were caring for them, but my parents were elderly and their health was fragile. And I had this idea that, gosh, maybe we could be their parents. Here's our chance to be dads. So we started having my nephews up for the weekends and just doing the best we could, entertaining them, having lots of fun. But in the end, it just didn't really work out for my family. These boys were pulled in lots of different directions. And sadly, as it turned out, it was determined that they would go to my sister, which is great. She did a great job with them. She had a lot of family support, so that certainly helped. But it did leave us with a sense of grief because our hopes really were that we would parent them. And because they were my brother's children, I thought, gosh, we lost him in such a tragic way. Maybe this is a way to sort of mend some broken heartedness that I was suffering. And maybe this will show our family that we're even, super supportive in this time. But we needed some time. I needed some time. I think Brad would have just, let's adopt kids right away. But I needed time to grieve. And I really took a year to grieve the loss of my 2 nephews. And we were having a conversation with a friend, and he said, well, why don't you adopt from the foster care system? And that fit perfectly. I got on the internet the next day, looked up Department of Human Services of Denver, and just figured out, gosh, what do we need to do? So they had an information meeting. I signed us up. We went, and just like our dating life, our dating life consisted of 5 dates, and then we moved in together. So, so after a year, here we go. Let's just check all of the boxes the Department of Human Services wants us to do, and let's do this. So we did, and it was an interesting experience because they really, I think, in really a good way, have you look at being a parent on paper, which isn't reality all of the time. But, for us in the situation that we're like, okay, this is what we're tasked with. Let's do it. We had to take a look at situations we might be dealing with. They intimated that there would be trauma, but they never used the word trauma. So they would talk about all of these situations, how, you might be placed with these foster kids and they might do X or they might do Y, and they would describe some sort of outrageous behavior, but they really never talked about the genesis or, what these children might be trying to communicate.
I wonder if that speaks to the age, because this would have been, 15 years ago? 16 years
20
ago?
years ago.
20, okay.
Yeah.
That, in my residency, and I've talked about this on the podcast, I was in residency in the early aughts. We barely talked about trauma. Like, It was a side dish at best. Like, in 4 years of training, it barely came up. So I wonder if, 20 years ago, well-meaning DHS didn't talk about these kids having trauma because that wasn't even in the discourse. It wasn't in the zeitgeist. Now it's everywhere.
Right. It is everywhere. And even furthermore, they never mention the word child abuse. You can't even talk to a doctor about child abuse. I think the only paper that I was able to discover online about child abuse, they called it child battered syndrome. And it's this paper from the 1970s. Wow. And they described these situations, but that's all it went. I never could find any other information on child abuse. So, yeah, Department of Human Services, I believe, really did the best that they could with what they were given. And I think even more so at that point, there was a lot of scrutiny on Department of Human Services. In Denver, I think probably the year before we went into the program, there was a death, of a foster child that had been placed in someone's care. So they really tightened up all of the rules, and they wouldn't even let us consider adopting at that time until we fostered our boys for a year.
Mm-hmm. Now in this age, if you talked with anyone about potentially adopting kids in the foster system, I think most people would assume these kids have very significant trauma. But 20 years ago, again, that wasn't even I'm guessing you thought, maybe these kids might have some issues or might have some challenges, maybe.
Right, absolutely. And I think at the time they were talking about mental illness as being genetic. And, or at least from my limited perspective and limited access to information, I'm like, they were born with these conditions. So, we're just going to nurture them. And I think everything will be okay. Little did we know that it would trigger our own trauma. And of course, we didn't know what trauma was. So we didn't know what was happening to us either. So yes, and it certainly didn't mention trauma at that time. Mm-hmm. Having said all of that, it was a great process. And I think that it also established us with a community of other people that were looking into adopting, children from the foster care system. So it gave us a sense of belonging, and, we would find ourselves in this situation all of the time. We were the only two same-sex parents. In this group, we would find that, in schools and, even in our community. But sometimes it made us a little bit of a celebrity, and other times we really felt like we were living in a fishbowl. So, it was both good and it was a little hard often.
When did you start to realize with your two, and they were biological brothers?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
When did you start to realize that maybe this was going to be a lot harder than you thought?
It really happened quite quickly.
Just to clarify, they were 4 and 2?
2 and 4.
2 and 4,
yes,
okay.
Absolutely. And,
and what did you know about them? I'm sorry, I meant to ask that.
So the interesting thing is when you work with the Department of Human Services, before you even get to meet children that are maybe going to be placed in your home, become a family, they give you this dossier and you sit down and have this meeting, and they're like, we're going to disclose everything we know about the kids. Once we had our meeting with Department of Human Services, what we learned about the boys was that their mom had used drugs in utero while they were pregnant. And then there were a lot of probablys. The probablys were, it looks like their father's a pretty dangerous guy. He was caught with 40 pounds of meth. He should be in prison for a very, very long time. Your kids were left alone in a meth house. Once they arrested, their father, they, found the children in a meth house unattended. We knew that looking through all of the health records, which DHS provided for us on that first meeting, we knew that my older son was having difficulty with language. And there was even something in there that he was being tested for Fragile X. We learned that in his early development scores, there's a WISC score that is often given to kids to see developmentally where they were. He scored in the bottom 3%. And at this time, he had less than 7 words in his vocabulary.
At age 4.
At age 4, absolutely. So, we definitely saw the developmental delays, and certainly on paper, we could see that, there was neglect, there was probably physical abuse, and probably a lot of other things. So that certainly tracked with what we were told. The other thing is with my younger son, he was in the 1 percentile for height and weight. So really seemed like there was some malnutrition going on there. So he was greatly compromised that way as well. It didn't really mention anything specific about my younger son, but one of the first things we noticed is sometimes when he woke up from a nap, his body would just shake violently. His eyes would have this look of surprise, and he was awake, he would see you, and then just start shaking. And of course, I had never seen that reaction in anybody before, so that really was very, very, very concerning.
What were some of the other early signs that these kids were going to really struggle?
The other early sign was during our classes with Department of Human Services, our parenting classes, one of the things that they told us was that the more placements a child had, the more difficult the situation could be. So in looking at their paperwork, it indicated that there were 2 prior placements. When I looked at that paperwork even more closely, there were 3 placements. So there was a lot of instability early on in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember, in those early months and year or two when you had them, like what your beliefs about parenting were? I mean, you knew ostensibly that these kids were going to have some problems and had some risk factors, but do you remember you and Brad thinking like, we can overcome this with love, we can overcome this with kindness, like we can parent these kids out of any potential problems? I mean, did you have any of those beliefs?
I really think we did. And, I think every parent goes into this situation with a lot of hope and optimism. But for us, there was just this duplicitous situation. We had these wonderful moments with the boys. I remember meeting them for the first time. My younger son had just woken up for a nap. He walked into the room and just went right into Brad's arms. We were only supposed to stay in their current foster care provider's home during that visit. But the social worker was there, and she put 2 car seats in our car and said, take them for a couple of hours and come back. Mm-hmm. So we go to the zoo, and the boys are just having a great time with us. So everything looked great. Everything looked spectacular. We're like, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. We can't wait till they live with us permanently. And we would have a visit a couple of weeks later where we brought the boys to our home. And my older son was quickly met by our dog and just completely melted down. That wasn't surprising that he melted down, but what was surprising was that the meltdown lasted for 3 hours, and there was just nothing we could do to soothe him. And once he was able to re-regulate, we would go out for gelato. We lived in a wonderful neighborhood. My family started stopping by. Brad's family stopped by, and the kids really were warm and friendly to them, and it looked like they felt safe and secure. That night, we would go out for gelato again. My son would see another dog and just completely break down, and again for 3 hours. So I think those moments were really, really hard because as a human being, you just feel so helpless when a child is... And it wasn't even that he was crying from a fearful place. He was crying from an enraged place. And it was just hard to imagine a child so angry at 4 years old.
When did it become clear to the two of you that this was actually maybe not just an adjustment phenomenon, that they were needing to warm up to you, or, they were going through, developmental stuff, but that this was actually kind of the early sparks of a major fire?
Well, at the time they weren't even talking about attachment, much less talking about trauma. So we were seeing a therapist at that time, and we would explain these incidents. And while we were talking to the therapist, our boys were sitting at a table playing with toys. And the first thing they did was build a volcano. And they held these figures over the volcano, and they said, "Mommy puts us in the volcano." And I stopped for a moment and I said to the therapist, I said, "Well, what does this mean?" And the therapist said, "It could mean a lot of things." I didn't know what that meant. To me, it seemed serious. Later, many, many years later, 10 years later, when my younger son was 12 years old, he would go into a dissociative state. And in that dissociative state, he would scream, "Stop burning me, stop burning me, please, please, stop burning me." And even to this day, I don't really know what that meant. But it's a theme in their lives.
Yeah. So it sounds like you began to slowly, steadily learn that it's not just that they were in a meth house or they were left alone or their parents had problems, but that they were actually abused terribly.
Absolutely. When the boys first moved in with us, I remember my older son taking his teddy bear and shaking his teddy bear and just saying, "You've been bad. You've been very, very bad." And I thought, my gosh, that's something that he has seen or experienced. The other thing is, with my older son, you couldn't make any sudden movement around him at all. He would flinch at the slightest movement. He had this sixth sense. He always had the sense of what was behind him. It was really rather uncanny.
So it sounds like as younger kids, they would be okay and then deeply not okay.
Exactly.
They could be fine. They could seem attached and warm and loving and, regulated. And then something happened, boom, they're horrifically dysregulated for long periods of time.
Absolutely. And it would be the most random things. It would be something like, "It's time to take a bath." And then all the wheels would fall off. And we're like, "Oh, wow." And then 3 hours later, they would get into the bathtub and everything would be okay. Or there was one incident that Brad experienced where our older son wanted help with clothing. And Brad, said to him, "No, you can do that." And then, he would just rage for 3 hours. And it was hard to see.
Yeah.
Really hard to see.
Do you remember what you were feeling back then, thinking, you and Brad, about your parenting? Because I'm guessing, of course, all new parents, whether they're biological kids, adoptive kids, are nervous about, like, can I do this? Can I parent? Like, how do you parent? And then, I can remember times with our kids just terribly tantruming and thinking and realizing I have no power here. There's nothing I can do. So I'm just trying to picture you guys like having these two little boys that are fine until they're just suddenly terribly not fine, and trying to figure out what to do and what does that mean. Is this something you need to change with your parenting, or how do you handle it? Or, what did that look like, those early kind of parenting feelings and discussions between you two as you're watching your kids just explode over seemingly inconsequential things?
Right. It was difficult to identify at the time, but again, I felt like we were living in a fishbowl. We were two celebrity parents. We were the only same-sex parent in the neighborhood, in the school, in the community. Everyone was looking at us. "Oh, look at the two gay dads with their two gay sons. What a beautiful thing." And it was really, really awesome. So we really felt like we had to get this right. And that was pressure we were putting on ourselves.
Yeah.
No one was expecting us to do this perfectly. But the hardest thing was, as a human being, just feeling so inadequate. You have a child in front of you who is struggling, and there was nothing we could do to make that go away. And there was nothing we could do to soothe it. And I really think that's what we were always pivoting towards was, how do we just even soothe this? And that which we don't even have a name for.
Because, right, if you think of what is dysregulation in a little kid and what, quote unquote, solves it. Time can solve it, but really what solves it is either they soothe themselves or you soothe them. But I'm guessing they really never learned how to soothe themselves, and they were not amenable to you two soothing them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But, I think there's a third factor in there. And what we've learned over the years is that in those moments, we had to soothe ourselves. And once we were able to soothe ourselves, the path forward seemed to be clearer. in terms of, okay, this rage is going to last 3 hours. And we actually did get to that point because we really came up with some strategies. One of the things we realized was we can't tower over them, when they're in an enraged state. Sit on the floor, say reassuring words. I remember during one particularly long episode that Brad was navigating, I just went downstairs, poured him a glass of wine, walked upstairs, crawled behind him, and just set the glass of wine behind him because I knew that it was going to be 3 hours. And, just trying to make him as comfortable as possible.
So that turned into one of your main parenting strategies was calm yourself, like just get ready to be in the storm and just sit on the floor and try to be peaceful.
Absolutely. Although when things would really get tough in adolescence, we didn't always remember that strategy.
Say more about that evolution from little boys, now in hindsight seeing we're totally traumatized, but now moving into adolescence and things are really heating up and changing. Like, what did that look like with your boys? What did that look like with you and Brad?
As a child goes into adolescence, their world becomes a little bit larger and a little bit wider. And, Brad and I were still in very protective mode, probably controlling mode is a better word for it. So we just wanted them to be safe. We just wanted them to be happy, but there were just a lot of circumstances beyond our control. As they headed into adolescence, we knew that their brains were changing. We knew that their bodies were changing, but we didn't know the word trauma, so we didn't really know how that would factor into their development. Brad and I talk a lot. After any major incident, I can always tell Brad anything. We can always talk about anything. And even if it's the most harebrained, parenting idea, he will sit there and listen and he will just cheer me on. And I'd like to think that I, am there for him as well in that way. So we were really, really good communicators, but that almost created a problem for our boys because they could never get away with anything. The other thing Brad and I committed to is that we would sublimate our careers to parenting. So one of us was always home. There really were a handful of hours that the boys were ever out of our sight or away. They were either at school or in some sort of organized activity or at a friend's house. But we were there. But consequently, I think what that meant for them was they never got away with anything. And we're like, oh my gosh, we got to be this two superstar gay dads. So we're going to catch them in every misstep that they make so it can be a learning moment, so they can be great human beings out in the world. And honestly, I think what that really, really did was it just drove them deeper into an alternate form of expression of their trauma. I remember all of this really started with my younger son, which really surprised me. I really felt when my older son entered adolescence that things might start to emerge. There was a psychologist in Oklahoma that worked with Indian tribes by the name of Dr. Rita Law. And I had read an article that she had read. And, one of the things she discovered was, oh my gosh, there's an overrepresentation of adopted kids in inpatient mental health, in the justice system. And here are the 4 stages. One of them was adolescence. So, I read this article before we even became parents. So I'm like, okay, adolescence here, I'm ready. One of the other things we both read was Foster Klein's book on parenting with love and logic. And if I remember this correctly, I swear that I read this in this book. Never engage in a power struggle with your child, but if you do, win at all costs. I look at that now and I think, oh my gosh, what were we thinking? But at that time, we had lots of teachers in our family. They loved Foster Klein. I mean, they loved this whole strategy to mentoring kids. So we really took that to heart. My younger son came home from a family event and he had 3 paragraphs that he needed to finish for his homework. So we sat him down at the dining room table and we said, okay, time to do your homework. And he wrote 1 paragraph. Writing was painfully hard for him. I mean, we should have celebrated that he finished 1, but we're overachievers. So we're like, nope, you got to do all 3. Well, at a certain point, he puts his feet up on the dining room table and he's like, no. And then we said, okay, if you're not going to finish your homework, you need to go to bed. And he's like, no. So we did get into a major power struggle with him. And he drove us to the point where he said, well, what are you going to do about it? And Brad said, well, we'll call the police. And he said, you'll never do that. Well, we called the police. And Brad was talking to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher said, what? Your child won't do his homework? Brad explained more, and she said, you know what? It's a slow night. We're going to send a couple of officers over. A couple of police officers would come over, and my son was really unfazed even with that externally. But I think what that really drove him into was I have to do something more extreme to let my parents know what pain I'm in. And that's when he started self-harm.
So despite you two, one of you always with them, following Foster Klein's dictum to win the battle if you enter the battle, it sounds like, full court press parenting, everything you could do, that actually is making things worse.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And how did that then devolve? You said into self-harm, and I know too, we had talked about before the recording that then into suicidality and...
Right. It really started with self-harm, and it was just so strange to me. I knew I'd heard about self-harm and cutting, I think was the word that was used. But we kept seeing large abrasions on my son's arms. And we'd ask him, how did that happen? Oh, well, I fell or someone pushed me. There was a bullying story that was going on at this time. And I do believe that someone was not being kind to him. So there were lots of things at play. But one of the hardest things to see was he had used a towel with so much friction on his entire lower leg, and his entire lower leg was covered in a scar. And it looked like a giant burn. We wanted to talk about it. We wanted to help, and he just completely would resist. He's like, I don't want to talk about it. And we're like, well, then you need to go see the doctor. It looks like it needs care. No, I don't want to go to the doctor. It was hard to digest. I'm not a medical professional, so to see an injury to a body like that was just really hard, especially my son. And again, feeling inadequate. Why can't I love him enough so he won't want to do that?
Well, gosh, I could imagine that if there were ever a time to start triggering doubts about, am I a good enough parent to have a kid start to self-harm, despite, as you said, you two making all these sacrifices and doing everything you can to help these boys, and yet they're getting worse, and now you're seeing this happen. I mean, do you remember that you and or Brad started to think like, can we do this, or are we parenting well enough, or were you able to maintain that sort of distance and say, no, this is still the legacy of what they came with?
Right. I think it was pretty easy knowing what we knew about their background to say this is the legacy of what they come with. But the other thing you have to know is Brad and I are a force. We have a great energy together, and putting our minds and our hearts and efforts and hard work and resources into parenting these two boys was something we were all in.
And you stayed on the same page.
Not always on the same page, but we were open to the other's perspective on what the situation might be.
Because boy, you could imagine, I see this again, either with biological kids or adoptive kids, when they're really going off the rails. I mean, that can rip a marriage apart.
Absolutely. And we actually have remarked about that several times throughout our experience as a family. Gosh, this could have ripped our relationship apart, but it didn't.
Moving on from self-harm to suicidal threats and suicidality, and then you guys are doubling down, trying to be more, tell me what that looked like on a parenting level.
Right. So
as you got more and more scared.
Yeah. Definitely started with the self-harm, behavior issues. We would get reports from school that our younger son was isolating. But in between all of that and what the struggles that my younger son was developing, my older son, I was driving him to school one day, and he yelled at me. He's like, "You don't understand. I just want to kill myself." And, I heard those words, and I stopped the car and I said, "Do you have a plan?" And he didn't answer that question, but I just turned the car around the opposite direction and we started driving towards the hospital. And I was just distraught and it was difficult to hear those words.
That was the first time.
First time.
Yeah.
But I'm no stranger to suicide because my dad and my little brother committed suicide. So hearing those words was, it's indescribable. So
no, imagine, like, talk about your most wounded spot.
Right?
Yeah. And I can see that in the tears in your eyes right now, that he says the worst possible thing, the worst thing that your son could say.
Absolutely. So, we got to the hospital and, in my older son's words, he would say that he told them everything that they wanted to hear. It was 7:30 in the morning. I don't even think there was an attending physician on duty at that point, but, they were consulting. And after talking to him and holding him there for a couple of hours, they agreed to send him home. They gave us a safety plan. I asked him, he had a noose in his room. And I said, would you be willing to give up your noose? And he agreed, and he gave it to us. So it seemed like, okay, so in a couple of hours, we've navigated that. So let's, fix dinner and do the laundry and start with homework and keep going at this. But it would be a couple of months later where my younger son, in frustration, would look at us and he would yell at us, I just want to jump. Again, we were in another power struggle. And he was referring to jumping off the roof of our house. And, I said, we need to get some attention. And we called 911. Police were kind enough to come. And they had a great conversation with him and basically told him, you need to go to the hospital. And you can go with us in the police car. You can go with your parents. And he agreed to go with us. We took him, and I felt so safe. We were at a hospital where I thought he's going to get the best care. Oh my gosh, this is fortuitous that this happened so early. Here we go. And 8 hours later, they would look at us and say, we don't have any beds. He's going into an inpatient facility. And there was a psychiatrist on duty. And I said, well, can you tell me more about where he's going? And he said, I don't know anything about the facility, but I'll find out. And he never came back. Next thing I know my son's being transported across town. We're following him. And he's being checked into this facility that's unkempt, good, hardworking people there, but not sensing a sense of psychological sophistication in their language. And I'm just kind of wondering, what's going to happen? He was checked in and they took him off, and I drove home and cried all the way. I'm like, what's going to happen to him? Is this the right place? And it wasn't the right place. No. We would go the next day and he would say, can you bring me a blanket? The heat doesn't work in my room. And we're like, under the circumstances, we again, we felt inadequate and absolutely helpless. But we stayed the course. Surprisingly, I've never told my younger son this, and, I did tell him this is my story. He looked so relieved during the check-in process. It's as if he sensed that there was something going on and that he needed help discovering what was going on, and this could be the place. And that was the weird juxtaposition. I did not want to leave him there. I didn't think it was the right place, but he looked so relieved.
Do you remember how and when you and Brad started to change how you were parenting? That, again, it sounds like you were doing more and more of the same, which is such a human thing, and things are getting worse and worse. And then how did you two come to realize that you needed to change it up and approach this differently?
It wouldn't be until, we experienced this cycle with my older son, and maybe not fully experienced the cycle with my older son, but as he began on his downward trend, there was this place in the middle. We were certainly trying to help my son. After my son's inpatient admittance, we would find him one morning with, 60 or 7 razor blade marks on his arm, which again defies description, and as horrifying as it was, I looked at him And we'd been getting feedback from school around his behaviors, talking about self-harm with other kids. And this was a very protected environment and such a great environment for my kids. I mean, academically, it was a great place. The teachers really engaged with us as a family. They were just cheering us on all the way. And this situation was very, very difficult. But that particular morning, I looked at him and I said, don't be ashamed of those razor blade marks. It's how you feel. Of course, he would go to school and show them to everybody. And we would get a phone call from the school psychologist, but that wouldn't matter at all because, a few days later, everything was shut down because of COVID.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like what you're saying there is acceptance.
Yes.
Yeah, like the way you said that, like this is the way you feel. Because, I see that a lot in my office, people bringing their kids in who are self-harming. And like, how do we stop this? How do we stop the suicidality? How do we fix this? Versus you just noticing it and being with it.
Yes.
Accepting it.
So I think that's really kind of a significant way that we at least started to change our parenting was acceptance instead of control, nurturing and control mixed in there, trying to, love everything in the right direction. But we would have to take that even so much farther.
Did you find that over the years of raising your boys that you had to change your hopes and dreams and expectations for them?
Never. Never. No. Again, it was just such a dichotomous situation because we would have these extreme difficult situations that would just break our hearts. And then but we also had all these wonderful times as well. No matter how deep in despair my boys have been, they have always revered family time. So a visit with my side of the family or Brad's side of the family or everyone would always bring them out from whatever state they were in. And it was comforting and it felt safe for them. We were a family. We had a lot of great times. We did so many fun things, little bouts of travel, dinners out, taking them to Disneyland, all of those other things. So I think that we never lost our sense of hope because there was still so much good there in spite of the dark times.
Even in these really rough, suicidal teenage years, there were still,
right.
There's still good times.
Yeah, absolutely. So my older son would start to show signs of, extreme depression and largely hidden from us. I think homeostasis has an interesting way of working because the worse my younger son became, the more in line my older son seemed to fall in. But, you could tell things were going on. He's like, oh, no, I'm not coming home from school right away. I'm doing X, Y, or Z. And, sometimes it sounded truthful to us and sometimes it didn't. So we knew something was going on and it would get much worse, much worse. Between my youngest son's descent and my older son's descent into this deep depression, we joined this enthusiastic sobriety community. And it's very, very interesting. Loving community. They accepted us. Everyone had a story that felt comforting. But it was really our first introduction to what I would describe as harm reduction, because they really encouraged us to, they had these events called hangouts.
Was it for parenting specifically?
No, there were two groups. So there was an AA-style group for the kids, and there was an Al-Anon-style group for the parents.
Oh, okay.
And what they would normally do is they would hold these two meetings at the same time. And then after the meetings, they would encourage us to let our kids go on these hangouts, go hang out with other sober kids. And they'd get in a car and drive to the sand dunes, or they'd go find some park and sit on a mountain and chat throughout the night. And it was very difficult. We learned to let go a little bit. It felt somewhat okay that they were with other sober kids. It felt somewhat okay that there were other parents that we were sharing our deepest, darkest stories with in group, that they were with their kids. So it all seemed okay. In the process of all of this, one of the things that the parents were encouraged to do was go to the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm a box checker, so I got right on that. And it was really the first time where I started to unpack a little bit about what made me tick and what made me afraid. And it was the beginnings of being able to discern, is this my fear or is this the situation at hand? Is this something internal? Is this from a past experience or is this from what's right in front of you?
What did you conclude?
Oh, it was all my shit coming up to the surface and getting mixed up with what was going on and just making things worse. So at this point,
I mean, you had 2 suicides of some of the dearest, closest people in your life.
Yeah.
How could you not get so, again, dysregulated and overwhelmed by this?
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But going through that is really, really useful. As a matter of fact, early on, I think my older son was probably maybe 12. He had his first dissociative episode, and it was just the strangest thing I'd ever seen. You know, again, it was me exerting control over the situation. I suspected he stole a bag of goldfish crackers from the food bank, and, you know, I just wanted to have a conversation about that, and it turned to him shoving and pushing me and cursing at me, and, you know, I just backed off, and I said, you know, I'm going to leave you alone for 15 minutes and I'll come back. And I came back in 15 minutes and he was on the floor in the fetal position. And the moment I walked in the room, he just started screaming, "Stop hitting me. Stop, please, please stop hitting me." And it just writhing in pain and writhing on the floor. And I had never seen anything like that in my, I didn't know what this was. So I don't know what made me think about this, but, you know, I tried to touch him and that made things absolutely worse. You know, I just sort of stared at the situation for about 10 minutes and finally I knelt next to him after he calmed down just a little bit. And I said, "I'm going to count backwards from 10. And when I reach 0, I'm going to take your hand." And I counted backwards and I held his hand and he immediately went to sleep. And I just thought to myself, this is the most bizarre, unbelievable thing I've ever experienced in my entire life. What's going on? And he would wake up probably 10 minutes later and he didn't remember a thing. And that was a significant event on 2 sides, because what that did is that awoke a deep trauma in me. You know, I had the same driving route to work for 15 years. And I remember driving by this apartment and I started remembering things. And I remembered, oh my gosh, I was drugged. And I don't remember anything after I was drugged, but what I do remember were all of the bruises on my neck and the bleeding I was experiencing from my rectum the next morning. And I hadn't thought about that in a long time. And I'm like, wow, where's this coming from? And I really think it was at that point, I'm like, I need to figure out if I need to spend some time unpacking my stuff. And this is really interesting how he's experienced this very dissociative event, remembering something, and it has triggered a memory in me. So I think that was really the beginning of trying to understand, is this about me or is this about my family?
I guess the message of Al-Anon, or, you know, Al-Anon for parents would be, it's you. Like,
right?
Your sons have their journeys. Brad has his journey. You have your journey.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's largely about you.
Yeah. It really is.
Yeah. I mean, if we could go back, like where you are now, everything you've learned about yourself in this process and parenting, you know, if you could go back and whisper in the ear of you as a dad 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I mean, what would you say? What have you learned now? What have you learned about yourself? What have you learned about parenting? What have you learned about trauma? I mean, what's the sage advice? Not that maybe you could have heard it 10 or 12 years ago, but what is it?
It's to be still. To be still, to be quiet. Therapeutic silence is just, it's a beautiful thing. And, you know, I work with kids now. And this is one of the things I tell the instructors all of the time. You know, when they see behavior that they'd like to be different, I'm like, just give them another minute. Just give them another minute. And it's so surprising to me to how often the behavior just self-corrects and you didn't have to say a thing.
It's so simple and so hard.
Yeah.
It's so hard.
Hardest thing ever. Yeah. Hardest thing ever.
Yeah. remember one of my daughters having an epic tantrum when she was like 2 in the line at a bank in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and she's screaming, and this woman next to me, she kind of whispered to me, clearly she's a mom, she said, "There's nothing you can do. Just be patient. Just be here. You can't stop her." It was so helpful. She's screaming bloody murder. I was so embarrassed. I felt like the worst parent on the planet. She just said, just be here. Just be still.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So therapeutic silence, definitely, and learning how to accept what you don't understand in front of you. You know, when my older son went into his deep depression, it was really difficult. I mean, you know, he made the choice not to go to school anymore, and I mean, to me, that was just unimaginable. That's not what we do in this society. You go to school and so you can get a good job, and he just couldn't. I mean, just as a parent, all those terrifying moments walking by his closed door, just wondering, is he alive on the other side of the door? And knowing, you know, if I knock on the door and ask him how he is, it's just going to enrage him. It just feels like it's going to make things worse. So I can't say anything. I just have to wonder, is he alive? And, you know, it just got worse from there. Just worse from there. We would find him one day drunk at 8 o'clock in the morning. And, you know, I would say, "It smells like you've been drinking." And he would just, "Nope, I haven't been drinking. Nope, not at all." And, you know, I would just sort of, you know, do the best that I could in that moment and just stay as long as I felt was necessary, and then go off to work and, you know, tag Brad as it. And Brad's, you know, doing his best to help in the situation. And he would leave the house for a few minutes and our son would drink an entire bottle of vanilla extract. And we would come home and he's out, completely out. And we had never faced that situation before. You know, he admitted to using drugs and alcohol, but we had never seen it to this degree where he was just completely out. And it's 10 o'clock in the morning. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's 8 o'clock at night. It's 11 o'clock at night, and he's still out. You know, at this time we had consulted with one of his counselors from the sobriety group, and they said, you know, 2 choices. You can call 911 or you can just let him sleep it off. And we're just like, okay, we'll let him sleep it off. So 3 o'clock in the morning, he comes into our room and he said, "I have a problem with alcohol and I'm afraid I'm going to hurt myself." Which, this kid is just amazing. I mean, to be able to say that, to ask for help, I think that's just so brave and so courageous.
Yeah. How old was he when he said that?
17, absolutely. So, you know, we went down to his room. We removed all the drug paraphernalia. We removed all of the weapons. He gave all of those up, and we moved him back into the room with his little brother that he had once shared when he was, you know, quite young. And, you know, his depression wouldn't go away. It would just get worse. And we didn't know what to do. At this time, he did say, "I think I want to try medications." During this time, finding a psychiatrist was not an easy thing to do. We had worked with a psychiatrist. We'd put my younger son on a cancellation list or a wait list for a psychiatrist. And we waited for over a year with our healthcare providers, which was just, you know, we didn't realize, you know what, let's just private pay and just put it on our credit card. I mean, that thought never even crossed our mind. And that would have been a possibility, but we didn't even think about that. So when my older son started meds, you know, things seemed to get better. I think he felt like he was being proactive, but things didn't really get better. And I started to question the care. And it really felt to me like we were going to someone that was prescribing pills. You know, I did a little reading about the medications and I'm thinking, you know, shouldn't he be in therapy and taking these medications? And they had therapists associated with the practice. So we got on those wait lists, but those wait lists were very, very long. So he was only getting one part of the treatment. And again, his depression just kept getting worse. And he'd go on drinking binges or he'd go on drug binges. The interesting thing was, though, no matter how drunk he got or how high he got or where he was in the city, he always found his way home. Always. Always.
I think that says a lot about you and Brad.
Thank you. Thank you. He would break up with his girlfriend. And I mean, as you can imagine with attachment and abandonment issues, how deep this would resonate. I didn't even put that together at the time, but as I look back, it just seems quite obvious to me. But this kid just clearly did not want to live, And I mean, we were doing everything in our power to just make his life brighter, and nothing worked. So I didn't know what else to do. And one morning he said, I just want to kill myself. And I looked at him and I said, it's okay if you want to die. It's okay with me if you want to die. And he looked at me and he said, you're the first person that's heard me. It doesn't even make any sense to me. But in that moment, somehow I was able to meet him where he was at. And I think we had exhausted all the other possibilities, and this was it. And that was the turning point.
You just held that.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. He put that out there and you just held it.
Yeah.
Embraced it.
One of the best and hardest moments of my life. Having said that, he still suffered the depression. He still suffered the suicidality. And we still had episodes. I mean, he got really drunk and he had a bicycle accident. And I looked at his phone records because I was just befuddled. Because once again, he came home. He was really, really drunk, but he came home. It was dark. I greeted him. I couldn't see any signs of injury, but all throughout the night, his limbs were flailing and hitting the wall. I'm like, wow, what's going on? And the next morning I would wake up and his face was just battered. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what happened? And he went into the bathroom and he just started vomiting violently. And as would be his pattern, he would lose all movement in his body and his speech would become slurred. And I'm like, is he having a stroke? Did he have a brain injury? I called 911, got him to the hospital. They did a CAT scan. Thank goodness, no concussion. It would take some time to recover, but again, it comes down to seeing someone suffering and being with someone that's suffering. How do you do that? What does love look like when someone else is suffering? Another episode would happen months later. It was really interesting. During this period of time when he was really suffering, we had an episode, and I could track it by the calendar. Every 8 to 10 weeks, there was this pattern. I could almost anticipate it. So sure enough, 10 weeks later, I find him in his bed, and he's unresponsive. Can't talk, can't move. I mean, his eyes are open, and he's trying to do something. He just can't communicate with me, and I'm like, shit, he's OD'd. So called 911, got him to the hospital. Waited in the waiting room forever. They ran toxicology and there was nothing in his system. And the social worker on duty that day said, I'm going to have a phone call, want to talk to you and Brad. And she talked with us and she said, this is what trauma looks like.
Wow.
Yeah. 12 years later, finally someone said the word. And that was a turning point.
I'm wondering where are your boys now? It's been quite an arc that you've been through with them. What's just the thumbnail on each of them? I'm just curious, what do they still struggle with and how are they?
They're amazing. They're amazing human beings. Brad and I did our best, but one of the things that we stumbled upon that we did right is we created a militant routine from the get-go, from day one. And I have to tell you that militant routine still sticks today in a different form, of course. So they're 19 and 21. Neither has finished high school. They're both working jobs. Quite frankly, I don't care if they work a day in their life. They can live with me forever. I will support them. I think that what they've been through is just tremendous, and that they've made it this far is the victory. We'll figure out the rest of the stuff. But even today, we were sitting at dinner with our son last night, and he said, I just love that we have dinner together. And we still have dinner together every night. We still have family events. The boys love going to a good restaurant. All of these things all of these rituals and routines that we created as a family early on still stick today. They're wonderful human beings. Their empathy is beyond pale. When I'm with them and we're out and about, anytime they see a homeless person, the first thing they do is go up to the homeless person and say, "Hey, how's it going?" Hand them a cigarette, and just connect with them. They realize that people treat them so invisibly, and they do not, and that's how they are with everyone. They mentor their friends. They have great conversations with their friends. They can talk about addiction. They can talk about trauma. They're open books. I think that they sort of gained the emotional maturity in their lives before they sort of gained all of those other didactic things like going to work every day or going to college, that sort of thing. I honestly believe that's going to come. And they got the hard stuff out of the way.
What trauma residues do they still have? They still have times where they dysregulate?
It's more difficult to detect. I'm not sure that they express it in the same way. Sometimes you can just see them staring off into the distance. I think that's a form of dissociation in its own way. I'm not sure what has crossed their mind. They're in contact with their biological mom, which I think just resolved and answered a lot of questions that they had, which is so great. So in terms of trauma expression, I haven't really seen it. And I'm just happy to report we have gone 1 year and 4 months without having to call 911.
Amen. That's awesome.
It definitely is. I know we just recently moved, and it really seemed to create some tension in my older son. He was just more reactive, a little easier to become frustrated or agitated. So that certainly was a sign, you think, of their trauma and other things that had happened in their lives. But today they're just great people.
I love that. I wonder, Frank, as we're wrapping up, lots of parents listen to Back from the Abyss, a lot of parents who have kids that really struggle, whether those kids are still in the home or have moved on. And I'm wondering what thoughts, insights, wisdom, compassion you might share with the parents who are listening to this, who are loving on either adult or younger kid, and that kid's really struggling, and maybe the parents are really struggling with their own feelings about parenting.
I think there are lots of paths forward to great outcomes as a family, and I don't profess to have the answer, but what was really important to me was taking care of myself, really in difficult moments, being able to look inside and ask myself, what are your needs right now? And if there were needs that I could meet, and Brad was great, he would step up and meet, and vice versa. It just seemed like we were in such a better place to deal with whatever horrific situation was placed at our feet that day.
Got to put the oxygen mask on yourself first.
Yeah, but you need to do that. But if the oxygen mask is, a salad, with grilled chicken, then let it be that. Or if it's a walk in the park, or if it's a date night, or whatever it is we use to soothe ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Or even just disabusing yourself of the notion that you can fix this, or that you have the power to change it, that sometimes what you most need is the patience and the grace just to wait it out.
Absolutely. And I really think when you start to look at your own history and how you grew up, your familial history, your community history, your genealogical history, if you can really begin to understand how that makes you respond to the world, I think that just makes it a little easier to see your children who they are. Mm-hmm. I picked up my son from therapy a couple of weeks ago, and he gets in the car and he looks at me and he said, "What are your hopes for the future?" And I looked at him and I said, "Kids?" And he said, "You mean grandkids?" And I'm like, "No, have a family if you want to, but I think I said babies. I did say babies." And I looked at him and I asked him, "What's your hope for the future?" And he said, "I hope there will be more children as lucky as me and my brother."
I think so many parents, whether biological or adoptive, they raise their kids with both conscious and unconscious expectations. I've become convinced, both as a parent of 3 adult daughters and also through my 20 years of psychiatric practice, that kids are on their own paths. We can love them, we can try to be patient and try to have a few firm boundaries and limits. But critically, we can't fix our kids or save them or expect them to become the young adults we want them to be. Children teach us that it's not actually about us at all. They show us that our healthiest stance is one of humility.